From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. This segment of our series is a really important one, and it's going to be a lot of fun to go through this discussion with what is an amazing group of panelists. We're going to be talking about the Constitutional Convention and the legislative article of the Constitution as it was rewritten back in 1972. Now, our panelist today, to my right, is Jerry Loendorf. Jerry is a CONCON delegate from Helena who was the vice chairman of the legislative committee of the CONCON. And to his right is Arlyne Reichert. Arlyne is from Great Falls, and she was a member of the legislative committee as well. And finally, directly across from me is Rich Bechtel. Rich was the staff member on the Constitutional Revision Commission, on the Constitutional Convention Commission, and in the Constitutional Convention itself, where he was the person who was doing all the lead staff work for the legislative article. So we have an amazing group of panelists here and a very important article to talk about, and that is, what are we going to do with our new Constitution and the legislative branch, which many people have suggested was one of the driving forces of getting the Constitution Convention called in the first place. Discontent, if you will, about the legislature around the state of Montana for a lot of reasons. But before we dive into the causes in that, let me just, we'll get a little personal here and chat a little bit with the folks about what caused them to want to be part of this magnificent change that occurred in the part of the Constitution. So, Jerry, I wondered if you might reflect a little bit about what made you, as a young attorney in Helena, decide I want to be part of this process.
Sure. Well, I was always interested in the Constitution from school. I had courses in the Constitution in both undergraduate school and law school. And then being in Helena, you're always involved in the government to some degree, it seems. My first job was with the Supreme Court, where I worked as a law clerk. And then I became interested in the legislature, living there too. And I never really thought about running, though, until the Supreme Court decided that elected officials could not run. And that eliminated all legislators, and there were really no candidates out there. So the election became wide open.
So you were looking for an easy route, were you?
Sure.
Well, it was helpful, I think, to take the usual suspects, if you will, off the list. The folks who would really desperately wanted to be part of the convention were legislators.
Right.
And the Supreme Court ruled on that, did they?
Yes, there was a provision in the 1889 Constitution, which has been carried over into the present Constitution too, that said in effect that people who were elected to an office couldn't be appointed, was the word that was used in the Constitution, to another office during the term for which they were elected. And the legislators were concerned about that, and they're the ones that brought the proceeding in the Supreme Court to have that determined. And the Supreme Court decided, even though that term appointed was in there, that it included elected officials, and therefore these people could not run for the convention.
And you ran from Lewis and, was it a 3-county district, was it? Or?
Yeah, it was District 12. Lewis and Clark, Jefferson, and Broadwater counties were combined.
And how many people were elected from there?
6.
6. So do you remember where you came in on the 6th?
I came in 5th. Fourth in the general, 5th in the primary.
Okay, okay, well, good. And Arlyne.
Yes.
How did you get kind of your heart into this thing? What brought you to the Constitutional Convention, and what level of involvement did you have up on the front end?
I was always interested in government, but I became a member of the League of Women Voters as a young mother, 5 children. And it was a wonderful organization, and ultimately I was on the state board with Marge Brown. Marge Brown was a very important person in this whole Constitutional Convention concept. And what we did, though, when I was in the League of Women Voters in the early days was go to Helena to cover hearings and cover meetings. And it was horrible because we'd go into the committee room and the various legislators would talk about the issues. Oh, yes, this is a great idea. This is a nice idea. But when it came time to vote, they said, we're in executive session. That's what they called it. The press and the people, everyone had to leave. Everything was secretive. And I thought, this is terrible. I mean, how do the people know what's going on? And we didn't know in those days because they didn't reveal the votes. The third reading, you'd see how it went, but you never knew what was going on. And we thought, the League of Women Voters thought, we have to open up this system. This was years and years before the Constitutional Convention. So I had a basic interest in
Now
government.
you were running from Great Falls, and that was
Right.
within the, how many people were elected from within that county?
12.
12.
Yes.
And how did you fare, by the way?
Well, there were 56 people running.
During the primary, there were 56 filed?
Yes.
Wow.
Well,
A big interest.
big interest, but I was very delighted, as Jerry said, because the legislators couldn't run. I was delighted that I lost the previous election. I ran for the legislature in 1970, and I was
Thank
mortified.
God I got beat. Huh?
Yeah, at the time, it deflated my ego. I hated being a loser. One of my sons said, you always said it builds character to lose. Well, I lost, but
And you became a character.
yes, but had I not lost, I would not have been eligible to be a Constitutional Convention delegate. So I'm very grateful. And I lost because nobody knew me, but when I lost, I went to the television network, Montana Television Network, and proposed having a program on upcoming hearings, because at that time nobody knew when a hearing was to be held, where, when, and I devised this television program, and they accepted the concept. And so I did a television program before I ran for the Constitutional Convention. I had all that. It was just happenstance. I mean, I didn't do it because I wanted to be run for, I didn't realize I was going to run for anything. But as it happened, when I ran for the Constitutional Convention out of 56, I came in second.
Aha.
Yes.
Now we're amongst someone who is really powerful here in Cascade County, I'll tell you. Now, Rich, you were a young guy then. I mean, this was some of your early work.
Oh, yes.
And you were with both the Revision Commission and the Preparatory Commission. They called it the Convention Commission, as well as the convention itself. Tell us, where did your interest in this come from?
Well, I was doing a master's degree in history, and I was studying the election of 1920, and it was...
when Joe Dixon was elected governor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Dixon and Mr. Wheeler, and it was
Yes.
the first time that the companies didn't control either of the candidates for the governor.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting issues in that campaign was constitutional reform.
Because the laws of especially the tax provisions for mining and things like that that were in the old Constitution were pretty scary.
But both governors wanted to be able to administer the state, and the way that the state
There's a radical thought.
the way the Constitution was constructed, no governor could run this state.
In fact, that stayed that
intentionally
way
done that
until 20's plenty passed
Right.
in 1970 election.
Right.
And so with the ungovernability, but you were doing a study, and so then You just
So I saw that they were starting to talk about convening a study commission and a convention itself if it were to pass a convention. So I just sent a letter off to the House and Senate, the majority leader and the speaker, and said I'd like to apply for a job if one comes up. And eventually they found that letter once everything happened.
Now, by the way, well, touch on this because as a staff person, you did a lot of work with Dale Harris.
Oh,
Can you
yes.
comment a bit on him? Because he's not around anymore, and yet he was an extraordinarily important individual in this whole process.
He, to be honest, was an organizational genius. And Dale had a vision of constitutional reform, and he, by circumstance, staffed both legislative council commissions that were created to review whether there ought to be a constitutional convention or not. And that was over about a 4 to 6 year period. So he had amassed a phenomenal knowledge of our Constitution and what was happening elsewhere. And he went to the University of Chicago Law School. And I don't think he was totally happy with that, but he also saw this dream might be coming to fruition. So he came back and he then became the staff director for the Preparatory Commission. And much after that convention, he, as I say, he was a genius in organizational, and the Advisory Committee on Intergovernmental Relations, which was the Cadillac national organization or study commission created by the president that studied intergovernmental issues. They would bring him in periodically for many years after the Constitutional Convention to help them figure out how to organize large-scale issues. So he was quite a fellow.
Well, this was kind of a springboard for you in your youth. Then.
Oh, absolutely.
You learned an awful lot, I presume.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I think it's reasonable to say that the most visible challenges in the Constitution were the legislative to the average citizen because of the 60-day session. Was that?
Correct. Correct. That was a big issue. It was an issue I campaigned on, and it was a big issue in the legislature. There was no opposition to getting rid of that 60-day limit. Where the issues, the issues were, you know, just how much more time should we give them? How often should we allow them to meet? Those were the two big issues that developed in preparing a legislative article.
You know, I think it's hard for people now that we're 40 years plus into this new Constitution. It's hard for folks today to realize the old 60 calendar day limit.
Right.
Not work days, 60
Right.
calendar days, and at the end of 60 days, if they didn't finish their work, they would stop the clock at 11:59 and put a shroud over the clock and pretend like they were still on the 60th day
That's right.
for a while, unless it was too long. I remember in '71 they had a 19-day special session and a 27-day special session, but quite often they would hang that shroud over there and work for a week or two and not get paid, but they were trying to finish their work, so it was pretty clear that it wasn't a functional system.
Yeah. To really understand how the problem occurred, you have to look back to the time the '89 Constitution was adopted. You know, at that time, Montana was a very small state, population-wise and in every other way. It had, I think, 16 counties, 38 state agencies, and it appropriated only $200,000, its legislature. By '72, the legislature was appropriating $380 million. Now that's like a small amount
Now, but still,
compared to, but it was a huge increase. But the big thing was the legislature by '72 was dealing with a lot more legislation. They were dealing with over 100 bills a session, and a lot of those bills were lengthy and complex. It wasn't just a number. It was, you probably know, you were involved in the executive reorganization process. And that bill, I think, was, yeah, it was about 404 pages. So, I mean, that's a project by itself to handle in 60 days.
yeah.
If you had to, you know, analyze that thing and decide how you're going to vote on every provision in it.
Yeah, you think about that 71 session where that was brought forth, and the sales tax was it was the big issue, and education funding, as along with routine bills. How could they possibly do the work?
Yeah, and they couldn't. I think
Yeah.
that session lasted 109 days, and in fact, in the last 24 years leading up to 72, no legislature had ever completed its work within that 60-day limit.
So that was the driving force. The secrecy, I think, was a driving force, although the secrets were so well kept that maybe average citizens didn't know what was being kept away from them.
Yeah.
But it was pretty tough to figure out. I think accountability may be a word.
Very important. But in contrast, the Constitutional Convention was assigned to write the new Constitution in 60 days.
60 days.
And they were given so much money, and interestingly, because of the nature of the Constitutional Convention delegates, we wrote it in 54 days, and we actually gave money back to the state, which is kind of unheard of. I mean, but there were so many factors that entered into that, because we sat alphabetically, and that helped tremendously. We were elected on party lines, but we decided early on we were going to sit alphabetically. And also we had Leo Graybill as president, and he could manage that group so beautifully. And he never cut off debate, and yet we wrote that Constitution in 54 days. And I believe, too, thanks to people like Richard, who educated me on the unicameral structure, we had a unicameral Constitutional Convention. We met in one house. We met in the chamber. There were 100 of us. There was nobody down the hall. I really feel that had there been another chamber, that the
You'd have never
Constitution-
gotten it done in 60 days. Yeah,
we wouldn't have
probably.
gotten it done at all, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of challenges in
Yes.
that, but that, by the way, the unicameral
Yes.
gets to you're mentioning that one house meeting, so to speak, in the convention, which was different than the bicameral,
Right.
which is the normal Senate and House, and bills have to pass between them. So we had a little experiment in unicameralism right there.
Right there.
But the issue of unicameral versus bicameral was one of the more substantive issues to come before the committee,
Yes.
the legislative committee that you guys served on.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, whichever
Well,
one of you want to start.
I feel that we were well informed beforehand. Rich was one of the he was the researcher for the legislative article, and we had all kinds of material on Nebraska specifically, because Nebraska is the only state that has a unicameral system.
See, I think it's important. Most Montanans probably, unless they took civics recently, don't know that there is a legislature in the United States, a state legislature that is a one-body legislature.
Right. And
That's Nebraska.
They've been claimed as the most accountable legislature, but that's all water under the bridge. The point is that our group of 100 delegates had to vote at one point whether we favored unicameral or bicameral. And interestingly, when we took the vote, 60 of the delegates were in support of unicameral, as opposed to 40 in support of bicameral. But there was such an air of civility then and compromise. I mean, you can disagree without being disagreeable, and that's what we did.
There is a radical thought you're
Yes.
advancing.
We decided that our committee would write majority proposals on both the unicameral and the bicameral, and we supported both to be proposed, but we realized in order to be practical that it was not wise to put the unicameral issue within the body of the Constitution without the public having a chance to decide. So we offered it as one of the 3 sub-options, and I think Richard
Very
can testify.
wise.
That was a
Yeah,
wise
I
move.
think in one of our subsequent programs we're going to discuss the way the ballot was structured,
Right.
so that there was a choice put
Right.
not to the delegates. The delegates gave the choice to the voters. You can be a one-house or a two-house
Right.
legislature. But there were other things that were in there no matter what.
Right.
I mean, the secrecy stuff was resolved
That's
Right.
right.
throughout, either way, right?
Right. The 2 articles were essentially the same, except for that one provision, whether you had a one-house or two-house legislature. And you know, looking back on it, the convention, as Arlyne has mentioned, itself favored a unicameral system, but the people in the state did not. And I speculated about that a lot. I think one thing the group that made up the convention spent a lot of time studying the two systems. And all the studies available at that time indicated the unicameral was, you know, less cost, obviously, no duplication, more accountability, all those things. But so why do people favor the bicameral legislature, which they often voted on? And if you look at our education system, you know, we're taught from elementary school and secondary schools that, you know, here's how a bill becomes law. It goes through these two houses and one always checks the other if they're doing something wrong. Well,
we've idealized the U.S. Constitution that way.
Yeah, you know, and it's almost become part of our culture, I think, a bicameral legislature. But when you start to look at it, the second house really doesn't check the first house to that extent. At least the studies at that time revealed that 90% of the bills that were killed in the house that they were introduced in, not by the second house. And then there was evidence of some what we'll refer to as buck passing. Legislators in one house sending a bill over to the other house, they didn't really want to vote against it for some reason.
Let someone else kill it.
Yeah, but they wanted someone else to do the dirty work.
You know, it is interesting that prior to the reapportionment coming on and forcing people representation in both the House and the Senate, that Montana, like many states, that they used the counties to apportion out senators. So it used to be in the old days that Petroleum County with 800 people had one senator, and Yellowstone County right next door with 80,000 people at the time, 100-to-1 difference, had one senator. So it was kind of like a mirror image of the federal. So that you could almost make a case for a bicameral under those conditions, but as soon as reapportionment came in and both bodies were apportioned based on population, that rationale went away. But nonetheless, people seem wedded to it.
Right, and I think it goes back to the you know, federal constitution. That's what we started with. But when you look at the reasons they have two bodies at the federal level, it was a big compromise between the more populated states with the states that were not well populated. The smaller states would have probably not come into the Union except for the Senate. So they were given an equal vote in the Senate, and then the House people were elected to the House.
They drove a good bargain when they were in the driver's seat, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, and once it's in there, it's in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So unicameral, bicameral was a big deal. The secrecy stuff, again, that was a big deal. How did you resolve that in the legislative article?
And that was resolved rather easily. We just said essentially that all meetings of the legislature, including committee meetings, are open to the public. And with regard to voting, which is just as important, the Constitution says all votes will be recorded and made public. And if you don't have provisions like that, there's no way for people to tell what their legislators are doing for them or to them or whatever. And if you're going to evaluate a candidate in an election and you can't see a record of what he's done, you're really hamstrung. You're limited to the brochures they send out.
One of the themes of this whole series is about the empowerment of people. And clearly nothing represents that empowerment perhaps more than making sure that they're informed before they vote.
Correct.
You know, this is a real way. I remember trying to do a voting record on the '69 legislature, and when I went through there, I thought, well, it doesn't tell you anything. You can't come up with any. You come up with third reading votes only, and by that point, you know, everyone would be 99-to-1 on every vote because everyone knew it was going to pass, and we just go with it, and nobody knew anything. So accountability, and that's part of the empowerment of people that is representative of the crucible of change we're talking about here. So the open meetings and recorded votes. What about the single subject thing?
That was important to me. It's a provision that was in our prior Constitution. And if you compare the state of Montana to the federal government, you can see how important it was. Maybe first I should say what the single subject provision is. It says a bill can only contain one subject, except for general appropriation bills, which wouldn't be practical to try to limit them to one subject. And you know, I just read in the paper the other day where the federal government, when they passed the provision allowing guns in Glacier Park, that was attached to a credit card accountability act. And so, you know, these things don't pass on their merits necessarily at the federal level. It's possible both of those pieces of legislation would have failed if they were not brought together. In Montana, at least, you know, bills have to pass on their merits.
So we were maintaining a constitutional provision of some importance in that case.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And let's speak a little bit about single-member districts. Rich, did you do any research on that at all?
Well, the whole state had there were major, it was, I think it's called Reynolds versus Sims,
Right.
the federal Supreme Court decision, which mandated that houses be apportioned by population, one man, one vote. But the whole state had a civics lesson as two legislatures tried to reapportion themselves and really couldn't do it. It eventually went to the court.
We had a federal court determine what counties were going to vote together and which ones weren't.
Absolutely. And you know, for a legislator, they only have 60 calendar days at this time, huge bills, and then try to apportion themselves at the same time. And it's a very personal decision. This is whether I come back or not. And so it was almost an impossible task, and we had witnessed that as a state. And so that was a very important provision, and that's where they developed the committee, an approach to have a Reapportionment Commission, to take that out of the legislature and allow a bipartisan body to develop it, send the recommendations, as I remember, to the legislature for comment, but the final decision remained with that commission. And I think that weren't they appointed by the Speaker and the minority?
The majority and minority leader in each house.
Each house, and then they appointed a chair.
And if they couldn't, the Supreme Court does it.
Right.
That's the way the provision is written. So the Supreme Court finally will appoint the chairman, the fifth member, if the other members can't do it. And sometimes they've resolved it themselves and sometimes they haven't. There's been a number of these. By the way, in one of our programs, Pat Williams is known for many other things.
Absolutely.
Talked quite a bit because he was one of the members of the first Reapportionment Commission.
Absolutely.
When they didn't really know how to crunch the numbers the way they do with computers today. They did a lot of hand maps and other things. But it is interesting that that right now a majority of the states still have legislatures doing it, and it is still a mess. Or in most states. Every one of these things is, or in the other states that they do it that way, are challenged to the federal court levels for being discriminatory or this or that. So this was a very forward-looking provision that you put in. But it didn't have to, by the way, reapportionment itself did not necessitate single-member districts. Now let's talk about a little bit about the actual single-member district portion of it.
Well, the importance of single-member districts, I think, is if you look at what we had before, particularly where you were from, Eileen, at Great Falls. Cascade County elected 12 people to the legislature. Everybody in the county voted on all 12. Billings was the same way. They elected 12 people to the legislature. And around the state, we had multi-member districts. So again, to help a voter, if they have to evaluate 24 candidates, if you're voting for 12, you have 2 on each side in the end, plus you went through a primary where you even had more.
Hey, that's a full-time job to figure that out, isn't it?
You just can't do it.
Yeah.
And so the single-member district, you've got somebody you can identify as your legislator. In fact, he's likely to come to your door campaigning. You'll probably meet him if you don't know them. And you know, I thought it was just a great leap forward in terms of helping people deal with the voting process.
Well, it is. I mean, it's stunning to think of trying to evaluate 24 candidates at one time, if you're a Great Falls voter at that moment. So when you ran later,
Yes, I
you
ran
were
in
in a
19
single-member district.
Yes, and I hit every house in my district at least once.
Uh-huh.
I visited with each and every prison because it's feasible. Couldn't do that when you run at large. But having served as a Constitution Convention delegate, I was elected to the legislature in '79. And I thought, well, maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was, but it was worse.
What were the, by the way, what were the experiences in the legislature that after we did some reform, what still was a problem from your perspective?
Well, it was a problem because of the very nature of the legislature. Transmittal deadline is horrible. By the 45th day, every bill that's introduced in one chamber has to go to the other. People don't know what they're voting on. It's just chaos. And I like to think I studied every bill, so I knew what was going on. But I still couldn't keep up with it. And that 45th day was horrible. But even worse than that, there is the abominable conference committee. When the House and the Senate can't agree at the end, 6 people, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, get to decide, take it or leave it. You vote on it. It's a horrible way to run a government. But from personal experience, I had one bill, Marge Brown helped me with it. It was a state-local revenue sharing bill.
Oh, yes.
And it was very well done. You know, Marge was an expert at that. And the Legislative Council was enthusiastic, and the House was very enthusiastic. I was in the House, passed beautifully. It got to the Senate, we couldn't even find it. The Senate senator who was supposed to work on it, I can't find it. They shunned it to the Agricultural Committee, where good bills go to die, you know. And they went from one committee to the other. I never did find. We couldn't testify, so the bill just died in the Senate. But I mean, that was an example, and I thought, you know, this isn't good. After being in the Constitutional Convention, where everything was open, right at the beginning, when I sat down, the Democrats were on one side, and the Republicans on the other. I had a lot of friends on both sides, you know, but there's that immediate confrontation. So alphabetical seating would have helped somewhat.
Yeah, let's go back and reflect on that a little bit, because that is not required in the Constitution. That was left, that was just a decision by the delegates themselves to, by rules, seat themselves alphabetically, and obviously the subsequent legislatures did not adhere to that principle. It's not required. Did you, was that a frustration point with you? And how did you think the divided form of Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other, which you experienced in 1979, how did that compare with the sitting alphabetically?
It made all the difference in the world. I mean, people didn't even know at the end of the convention whether your seatmate was a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. We have 5 independents. We didn't know and we didn't care. We looked at issues. And I think that all government would be so much better if you didn't have this divisive confrontation. So alphabetical seating, it's a very simple matter. You know, it's just a rule change. It could be done. Whether the legislatures will ever do it, I don't know. But our former chief of the Supreme Court, Carla Gray, was one of the strong advocates. She came and spoke to us when we had one of our Constitution Convention reunions. She said, I'm all for that alphabetical seating. And I think many people are. Maybe we should get an initiative going.
You know, you wonder if maybe it's one of those type of changes that has to be imposed upon.
I think
because
possibly.
people are pretty hidebound about doing things the traditional way, and that's one of them. Now, let's see what else we have. Would you, Rich, take a second and talk a little bit about the front end before we got into the convention, about kind of the sense of change that was going on with the Kassebaum and the Eisenhower commissions, and this whole idea that the old Constitution basically was the people against themselves, so to speak. Would you, because that was part of what you were doing with your life at that time.
The commentators in the late 1800s, they basically called our constitutions and the ones, our surrounding states, the American people against themselves. And it was for a reason. There's a public consciousness, or you just operate from. And at the time, America after the Civil War was a time of great growth, internal infrastructure, canals, highways, all those kinds of things. If you needed a divorce, or if you wanted to incorporate a company, you had to have an act of a state legislature or to do that. We had no general instruments of government. And so there was it became vast corruption. And at the same time, we mentioned before, they had just come out of Reconstruction after the Civil War, and all the territories had appointed governors, and in the South, they had what they called carpetbagger governors.
Yeah.
And so all the constitutions written during that time were designed to absolutely make it impossible for an administrator, a governor, to administer the state. And for legislatures, they felt if you could keep them out of the Capitol, and then when they're there, only let them meet for a few days, they could do you the less harm. And that's exactly what the mentality was that created our first Constitution. And then in the 50s and in the 60s, we started having terrible problems addressing our issues in each state. And President Eisenhower created the Kessenbaum Commission, and they studied government across the country, and they found that power was flowing to the federal government, exactly the opposite of what most of our states wanted, but it was because we couldn't address our issues. And so there was commissions and study groups created all over the United States, and Montana had study groups in almost every town. There was a committee on legislative reform. There was a committee on court reform. They were all over the place. And so it was in the air that we needed to be able to step up and address the issues that are arising for us, not allow it just to go to the federal government.
So the context was pretty amazing in terms of the desire for change, but it wasn't unique to Montana, albeit we had worn the copper collar for a long time. And the structures of the legislature, the secrecy of the legislature, the constraints on both legislative power and executive power seem to historically, at least good Montana historians, say it served the interest of the outside interests, that people with economic power held sway over political governmental power based on the structures. So now that showed itself, by the way, in terms of when the vote came for calling the convention. For example, the urban-rural split was there pretty much, that the rural areas were mostly against calling a constitutional convention. The urban areas were for it, for calling the convention. An exception was in the Butte Anaconda area. And that is, of course, where the Anaconda Company, the Montana Power, its sister company, were so strong politically that they were voting against change because that was a change that the power structure of those counties did not want. Yeah.
To follow up on what Rich said about people all over the state being interested, that carried over to our Constitution Convention. We had citizens groups all over the state, and when we had hearings, we had people coming and groups supporting the Constitution or working against certain issues, but there was a great deal of interest because of this public concern emanating from what Rich was talking about.
Even in the legislature, there were many, many legislators trying to make their organization effective. We had the reform that occurred to create a legislative council, and many legislators, they're the ones that voted to put the Constitution on the ballot. So there was a lot of folks within the legislature itself that wanted to see the change because they were experiencing it day to day.
There was a study done, I believe, of the old Constitution by a legislative council committee. They thought they would have a commission. It didn't pass the legislature, so legislative council created a commission. Senator Groff and Senator Turnage, I think, were in charge of that. And they found that 20% of the provisions of the Constitution were okay, but bottom line was 30% of the constitutional provisions should be thrown out. They were totally archaic.
That's what I recall the results of the study. I recall they thought half were okay, 30% should be thrown out.
20% could be changed, and 30% should be thrown out.
Yeah. The big, I think, thing that they needed to change very badly that didn't let them operate. You know, you mentioned that 60-day limit, and if they took Sundays off, they had 58 days. But where they were really hamstrung was when they got to the 60th day, they were done. And the legislature could not call a special session. Only the governor could at that time. And then
now they can call themselves it,
right.
but back then they could.
Right. And the session was subject to the scope of the governor's call. In other words, he controlled them after the 60th day. They couldn't take up anything he didn't authorize. And that for, 305 days out of the year, the governor controlled the legislature. So it's illusory to say that the legislature was a real check on the executive back in those days.
And that is why they would hang that shroud over the clock and stay as long as they could under the so-called magic 60-day thing.
Yeah.
I thought, when the first time I saw that happen, I actually couldn't believe it. It was so colorful. I was there at midnight, and boy, at 1 minute to midnight, they stopped the clock. They physically stopped the clock, and it was 11:59, covered it up, and kept going.
Yeah.
And you know, I hadn't thought about it, but sure, they were totally under the control of the governor after that.
Right.
Now that is under the new Constitution and the legislative article. The legislature is empowered to call itself into special session.
Right. It needed to be. And the other thing, and this was the reason I was never too concerned how many days, what limit we set, whether it was 80 or 90 or 100 or whatever. There's a provision in there that says the legislature can extend that limit for future sessions. So 50 years from now, they may see the current 90 days we have is not enough. It won't take a constitutional convention or a constitutional amendment even to change that. The legislature can vote that change.
Now, in the legislative article, you came up with a divided approach, which was a unicameral, bicameral, and that went on the ballot as a choice.
Correct.
But both of them were annual sessions.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, tell us about the decision to go annual sessions.
Yeah. Well, that the legislative committee proposed annual sessions, and annual sessions of 90 days or less. The convention as a whole modified that to a 60-day session, a 60-day annual session. And then in '74, I believe it was, an initiative changed it to a 90-day biannual session, which we've had ever since. The annual session never really got off the ground. We had one session of it. But what that initiative did, besides extending the date, there were a couple other provisions in that legislative session article that made an annual session functional. And that was a provision that the legislature would be a continuous body, and as such, it could take up a future session, a special session, or even another annual session could take up bills at a prior session with the same status they were left off. If a bill had passed the House, didn't get the same, they didn't die.
Session ended,
Yeah, so you needed that provision for management. Otherwise, if you had annual sessions and everything was considered dead at the end of the first session, you'd be right back the next session with that whole pile of bills. So you had to have good management, and that gave you one of the tools for it. Like a legislature in annual session could provide that, you know, any bill killed in this annual session cannot be reintroduced, even a similar bill, or they'll make small changes at the second annual session within the biennium for which you have the same legislature elected. And you know, if you did that, and you would have to allow for the introduction of some bills, you might want to regulate that by allowing only committee authorized bills to be introduced that second time. But
But you did conclude as a body that you wanted to have annual sessions.
Right.
Absolutely.
And there were some. Now,
did.
Arlyne, can you reflect on your thoughts on the annual versus biennial, because it came out at annual sessions?
I was very much in support after viewing the legislature as a legalman voter, and also just on the basis of the practicality. I thought an annual session would be much handier. After oh, we're handling millions of dollars, maybe billions now.
Hundreds of
Oh,
millions,
but we
yeah.
have to project over a 2-year period. I mean, it's, you wouldn't run a business that way, but to run the state that way, it's kind of held us back.
So I think it's important, and let's take a second and go look up a little bit beyond the actual adoption of the Constitution to this amendment to change it back, to change it back to biennial rather than annual. That was brought up, it would appear, by substantially, although there were legislators from both parties, and including urban leadership, some of them supported it, but by and large it did represent kind of an urban-rural split to begin with, and it was brought by the Farm Bureau, among others, who were they opposed the Constitution when it was being adopted, and once it was adopted, immediately after, we had in the 73 and 74 years, we had annual sessions.
Right. They didn't give it a chance.
But by
really.
the end of 74, in the election, they put it up and it passed. It was an initiative. It was not done by the legislature.
Right.
An initiative, and it was passed by only 6,000 votes. And you know, it's interesting that all the urban areas voted for it except for 2, which was Butte-Anaconda, which was similar to the situation we just described, which is clearly the powers that be there wanted the old system because it represented kind of a powerful structure that they could function in. And Great Falls, which was your community, didn't vote to the degree for it that it maybe should have. What
There was
brought
a
that
strike
about?
going on
A
at that
strike?
time. Newspaper.
What kind of a strike?
Newspaper strike.
Newspaper strike.
Yeah, that's right. And so that, I think, affected the vote. But
So people were not tuned into the
No.
arguments because there was no newspaper.
really,
Nor an endorsement from the
no,
paper,
nor
right?
endorsement, nor
Interesting
much involvement.
reflection on the power of the press.
right.
Yeah.
You know, we tend to dismiss that sometimes, but with a narrow 6,000 vote loss because of the Butte-Anaconda situation and the strike in Great Falls, the Tribune strike, perhaps we'd be in annual session still.
Well, there's been an attempt since. I mean, I think for 45-day sessions, you know, to handle fiscal things one year and regular bills the other. I mean, there were all kinds of proposals, but they just haven't gone. And people, some people just don't feel that this legislature should meet every year.
Well, you know, I've worked for 3 governors, and one of the standard jokes, you know, among the governors is that the legislature meets for 90 days every 2 years, but we'd prefer if it met for 2 days every 90 years.
That's right.
You know?
Heard that
But
before.
it's understandable the executive would feel that way.
Yes,
But actually, a lot of reform occurred. Not every bit of reform occurred, and not all of it was retained. But all in all, how would the 2 of you reflect on the change and how it's held up over time or not?
Yeah, well, except for that change to biennial sessions, I think it's essentially the same. And I think the changes that were made, opening up the legislature, requiring votes to be recorded, allowing people to be in the committees, have made the legislature a lot more responsive to what's going on. That conference committee, even though it has a lot of authority at the end, there's now people in there watching them. There might even be a television camera, you know, focused on them while they're making decisions. So I think the risk of people doing mischief is essentially gone. And the other thing I think is, you know, the voter himself has been empowered to a large degree. They now know their legislator better, have better contact with them, and can communicate with them while they're in session. They can find out what's going on there, and you know, it seems to be a better process. But that said, you can never take politics out of a political system. And you know, the politics get kind of tough sometimes. You wish they were a little different. People got along a little better. But that's something we just have to live with in a political system. No matter what type of legislature structure you devise or system you have, the people who ultimately run it have to make it.
There's no utopian system.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that right now perhaps the times are different in the sense of there's a harshness to politics these days, but there's a lot of reasons for it. Yeah.
To follow up on that, one of the negative approaches that have been made since the Constitution passes, the term limits. A lot of people say we've lost a lot of continuity, a lot of expertise. I think of people like Francis Bardno, who's long remembered for his action on the Appropriation Committee, who served term after term after term. Thank goodness, because he had the expertise. There were many like him. And now, with term limits, I think that's one of the problems with the legislature today. We have all these people coming in. They haven't really learned what it's all about. The learning process takes a while. By that time, they're out. They can't run any longer.
An argument can be made that the term limits empower bureaucrats and lobbyists.
Exactly.
Because legislators can't get on top of the game well enough before they're suddenly gone. It is a complex process.
There's no institutional memory.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now, everything's a double-edged sword.
Sure.
You know, that when the argument of freshness and newness has some validity too. You know, some people can be in there so long and they're of no value, but they're still there because you know, don't throw old Joe out, you know.
Yeah.
But that is no longer prevalent. And now we're now experiencing that one edge of the sword, which is we have fresh new people, but we lose some of the continuity. And historical memory is somewhat important in these processes. So that's one, I guess, that's just hanging out there still.
But on balance, the Constitution's been great. I mean, other than the legislative article, we have to think of a right to a clean and healthful environment. We have to think of the right to privacy. The federal Constitution doesn't guarantee a right to privacy, but our state Constitution does. And we have other innovative provisions.
I think our Bill of Rights is
Bill
a
of
rather
Rights is
astounding
excellent.
list
Yes,
of things
that's
that we're
right.
covering in another program. As a document per se, I think it was, it continues to be well received as perhaps maybe the best in the nation among
That's
state
right.
constitutions.
It is.
Model document, they call it.
You know, I always say with people, if someone comes from 50 miles away with a briefcase, they're an expert. So there have been a lot of people who come in as experts and said, boy, Montana put together a good constitution. How do you feel about your role as a Constitutional Convention delegate now? You're looking back 42 years now.
Looking back, well, I wouldn't have done much different, but I wish I hadn't put that one provision in the legislative article that said the legislature is a continuous body, because so many people seem to misinterpret that to mean the legislature will be in continuous session. If I could write that one provision over, I'd do it. But other than that, you know, you have to accept compromise. There's a lot of things in the Constitution that I would have done differently. For example, I would not have an education article. I just like all the recent constitutions, there were 6 of them written right before we did, which were helpful to me. I read them. They were new constitutions, but they all left that up to the legislature. The legislature shall provide for a system of public schools, one sentence. We've got a pretty big structure is with regard to our educational system in the article. Now, I went along with that because, you know, you just have to accept other people's ideas. Everything can't be just like, you know, you would like it. So, but all in all, I was really pleased, and if I had to go there again, I'd certainly elect Leo Grable as the president. I read through some of the transcript in preparing for this meeting with you. You know, it's been 42 years since we've been there, and I was amazed at you know, how undisciplined we were at times. We were not used to a parliamentary type process, and Leo, the way he controlled that convention, people were making motions, making substitute motions, amending the substitute motion, and he had kept track of everyone and kept them in order. They were decided in order. And
he had a very disciplined mind.
He did.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly did.
And a great wit. On one occasion, one of the lay people asked him, Mr. President, he was a lawyer, would you please assign someone in this room who's a lawyer to explain to us what the other lawyers are talking about. And Leo Graybill said that is virtually an impossible task. He had a wonderful sense of humor.
Let me take 1 second before we move, and we're getting close to using up our hour, which goes so darn fast. But there was one person on your committee, Bob Kelleher, who was an advocate of a parliamentary system.
Yes.
Can we just take a second and reflect on Bob's efforts? And I assume people gave him the credit of good thought about his processes, but they didn't go there.
Highly intelligent man. But unicameral wasn't enough for him, although he was ready to support the unicameral. And interestingly, when we had the 2 majority proposals before us, which Jerry had helped compose, Bob Kelleher voted with everyone else for the majority proposal, citing a unicameral. When it came to the bicameral, all of us supported the bicameral, except for Bob Kelleher. He wasn't going to even give them the support on that one
I
vote.
suspect that there was no room in his parliamentary procedure for a House of Lords. But we would have had to have had a prime minister instead of a governor to make that work. It was pretty radical, and it didn't make it. But Bob, you know, stayed with that for the rest of his life.
And so bright, very bright. We had so many bright delegates. And what's sad now when we have reunions, we just had a reunion a couple of months ago, and of the 100 delegates, there are only 25 of us still alive.
And not all of them come to the meetings.
No, some of them can't.
It's a very small room.
But of the women, we had 19 women, and there are 5 of us of the 19. And of the men, of the 80, there are 20. Wow. So,
well, as
sad.
one of those 19 women, I want you to know that it looks, when one looks at the actual record, it looks as if that was breaking a glass ceiling like you wouldn't believe. That in the session before, there were only 2 legislators who were women, Tony Rozelle and Dorothy Bradley. And that was kind of the pattern through the 60s, was maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 one session. And all of a sudden, there were 12 and 15 and 17. That's still not a representative amount, but clearly when the women, such as yourself, ran and had such a role out of the 100 in the Constitutional Convention, it made a big difference for future women in the legislature.
That's right. And but one of our happiest moments, Jeannette Rankin was one of the guests who was invited, and she was 92 years old at the time. And when she came, she invited the 19 women to have a special dinner. I kind of felt sorry for the men. But she had a special dinner for all the women delegates, and she told us so many things. She had so many great ideas. Fascinating. And the main question that was asked after her talk was, Vietnam was raging. And she was asked, what would you do if you were in Congress now? And she said, I would send those same ships and planes that took those young people over there and bring them right home. At that point, we'd have saved thousands of lives.
She headed a peace march in Washington, D.C. right after that, too.
Yes.
You know, it's very, very interesting, and we've used up our time. You've been an extraordinary panel. Your knowledge is amazing. Your recollection is good. You dealt with such an important article. The thing that really drove a lot of the new Constitution to come into existence. I mean, Rich, you emerged with a career after this that, from what you learned, you both remained leading citizens of Montana through all these years. We are so pleased that you were able to come here and reflect on this important article.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity, Evan. We really appreciate it.
This series is about the empowerment of people, and you, I think, had that in your minds as you did everything in this legislative article, and it stood the test of time, and we want to thank you for what you did for the citizens of Montana, and thank you for being with us on In the Crucible of Change.
Thank you.